Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Betting Life Show brought to you by Fantasy Life. I'm Matthew Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. This week on the PGA Tour, we have the U.S. Open at Pinehurst Resort and Country Club in North Carolina. And here to break it down is Geoff Ulrich, a.k.a. the Fantasy Grind. Jeff, how's it going?
It's going good, man. This is, U.S. Open, pretty much my favorite PGA event of the year. Definitely my favorite major. And I think Pinehurst No. 2, definitely one of the most unique courses we get. It's definitely one of the most, just from an aesthetic standpoint, nice to see, and just one of my favorite courses on the rotation. So, yeah, pretty pumped for this week, man.
All right, well, talk to me about the course. Pinehurst No. 2, par 70, a little over 7,500 yards. Talk to me about what we need to know about the course.
Yeah, so Pinehurst No. 2, it's fourth time hosting the U.S. Open. Hosted back in 1999. If you're a real golf fan, you remember Payne Stewart battling Phil Mickelson down the stretch. He did the famous punch the air when he won, and there's statue of Payne Stewart. And that was from Pinehurst. They also hosted in 2005. The course we're seeing and the course we saw in 2014, Pinehurst No. 2, is completely different than the courses we saw in 05 and 1999. There's a complete restoration. They basically tore out all the rough. There's a huge story behind it, but basically they planted a bunch of rough, way back in the 80s or 90s, and they just took away from the natural, how it looked. So there was a huge restoration done in 2011. 2014, we saw it. There's no rough on this course. There's what we call natural waste areas. So it's very unique from a U.S. Open standpoint, because most U.S. Opens, what they have is layers of rough. They have really high rough and then really, really high rough. So when you miss the fairway, you're hitting out of the rough. There's no rough here. There's just none. It's just standy waste areas. So what it does is it adds in a lot of variance, because you can hit it off center, off the tee at Pinehurst, and you could still be okay, because if you get a flat lie in a sandy area or you get a little patch of grass, you're going to be good. But you can also get stuck in sand. You can get, stuck in a bush, and then you're basically taking a penalty. So it's a really unique setup. We don't see this basically at any other U.S. Open courses. And it's really more the course we're seeing is really more in line with what we see at an Open Championship, or even I've heard people compare it to the Players, like TPC Sawgrass, which I think is actually pretty valid. So it's a really unique course. The greens are all bowl-shaped as well. It's another feature of Donald Ross. Donald Ross designed this course. He's designed a couple other courses on the PGA Tour, Sedgefield, which hosts the Wyndham Championship, and then East Lake. So we're going to see really fast greens, really tight lies around the greens. People are going to be putting the ball. People are going to be putting the ball off the greens because they slope so much, and it's just going to create havoc. Typical U.S. Open from the fact that we're going to get the fast greens, we're going to get the 3 putts, the 4 putts, but untypical from the fact that Pinehurst really random off the tee, no rough, and you're going to have these waste areas, which are going to be a huge factor of this tournament.
All right. So what are the key holes? I know a lot of golf courses will have kind of signature holes. Are there any for this specific course?
Yeah, so I would say there's really not what you call a signature hole on Pinehurst. It's just the whole course is just kind of it just sort of flows the same. It's you're getting bowl-shaped greens on every hole. You're getting these sandy waste areas on every hole, and some of them have a little bit of dog legs, some of them don't. Some of them have more sloping greens than others. I've just reading through the research, number 5, which is a par 5. I think it maybe used to play as a par 4, but it's a par 5, and it's got what most people call is the toughest green on the course, because the flat part is there's such a limited flat part where every other place rolls off the green violently, and you can roll your ball literally 50 to 70 yards off the green, which is insane, because you could hit 2 good shots, you'd become right up next to the green, and you just put a little bit too much emphasis on your chip, and all of a sudden you're actually further away on your 3rd shot. So probably the 5th as the toughest green, but realistically, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a signature hole on this course. They're all just really kind of unique holes. And I think that's what makes this course so cool, is that you're going to see something a little bit different because of the natural waste areas and because of just how the greens are set up. So not really a signature hole. It's just sort of a course that has a lot of different features. And every hole has these features. They have the fast greens, they have the waste areas. And, as a player, you've got to do your best to deal with the waste areas and be accurate enough off the tee. And I think you're going to see some players lay back here and also just be smart enough around the greens that, you can, whether you're going to use putter, whether you're going to chip with like a 7-wood or something, you've got to be able to deal with that on every hole. So it's going to test a lot of clubs, which I think is great. And it's just like, I don't want to say every hole is a signature hole, but every hole I think is like an extension of what they're going for. So really unique setup. Keep that in mind. And as we get to the bets, we'll talk about how it's going to affect like how I think you should be approaching this tournament. So
You mentioned different courses earlier. So you said this kind of plays a little bit more as if it's an open championship. You mentioned Sawgrass. You also mentioned Sedgefield and East Lake as courses that have the same designer. Are there other courses that this is similar to?
So I mean, not really. I think like when you're comparing something to an open championship, you're comparing it to like a lot of links courses, which again, like if you look at most links courses, there's no rough, but they do have fescue areas, which can be like really penalizing, right? So that's kind of what Pinehurst has turned itself into. It's got fast, firm fairways, and when you run off the fairway, you could be okay, but you could also just be dead. So really most links courses I think compare pretty well to Pinehurst. It's definitely closer to a links course than it is like most traditional PGA setups. And then I mentioned Sawgrass. I think that as a comparable, I mean, TPC Sawgrass has really tight lies around its greens, a little bit of runoff as well. So I think that's somewhat similar, but just from a off the tee standpoint, at Sawgrass, it's, if you've got a lot of water in play, which can be penalizing, but it also just adds the variance where you can be a little off center and all of a sudden you're dealing with a penalty instead of just having to hit out of the rough like we see in most US Open setups. So it doesn't really have like a straight up comparable, but when you look at the leaderboard and when we talk about like what kind of golfer, maybe you want to look for, you can kind of see like, oh, Ricky Fowler finished second here in 2014. He also won the Players. The same thing with Martin Keimer. And then, we can go on and on, but certainly there's a comparable more to these higher variance courses that have like almost water and some tighter lies around the green than necessarily like true US Open courses, which again makes this week, I think, pretty unique. So.
All right. So you've mentioned a lot of volatility at this particular course and similar courses. And so maybe it's a little bit more difficult to identify like this specific type of golfer tends to do well at this course, which means like it could be much more of a wide open event, which especially from a betting perspective could be really intriguing. But what kind of golfers tend to do well at a course like this?
Yeah. So again, like most US Opens, you come and you can say, okay, who are the big hitters? Who are the guys who are going to be able to withstand the rough, get their ball up? And you can literally probably narrow down the list of winners to like maybe 15 guys, maybe not quite, maybe 25 guys, because most players are just going to be able to withstand the kind of rough and the length of the course over 4 days. I mean, again, like Bryson, this is why Brooks has won it twice. Even last year, Wyndham Clark, really big hitter off the tee and good putter. And he just sets up so well for a US Open. He's in terrible form right now, so we're not going to mention him anymore. But certainly last year he was coming in with good form and made a lot of sense. So that's not what we have at this US Open. You're just looking back at the 2014 leaderboard. I mean, Martin Keimer won. He had just won the Players like a month prior to that. Ricky Fowler was finished second. He had basically missed a ton of cuts. He was in terrible form coming in. And then Eric Compton, a guy who was ranked like 500th in the world and went off at like 350 to 1, finished T2 in 2014. Like you don't see guys like Eric Compton finish T2 at the US Open. It never happens. But on Pinehurst, it does happen because it's just such a random course. And, again, it's not necessarily how big you can hit it off the tee and how far you can bomb it and how strong you are out of the rough. It's, can you handle these greens? Do you have the right approach on the greens? Some of the good players are going to figure out the greens really quickly. Some of the good players aren't, and they're going to have terrible weeks. And that's going to create a huge amount of volatility. So there's these things that you have to figure out that you just won't have to at most US Opens. And that's going to create a really crazy leaderboard. And when you look down also from 2014, you see guys, Jason Day, Brandt Snedeker, Adam Scott, Jim Furyk. Most of these guys aren't big hitters. And the other thing, they're just very skilled around the greens. They're very smart around the greens. They're good scramblers. They use different clubs. They're not someone who just has like a one-trick pony. So, players with experience playing at the Open, players with experience doing well at Sawgrass, courses like that, they really excelled here. And, I think you're going to see the same thing again. You're going to see an eclectic leaderboard. I'm not saying all the big hitters are like out of play. Certainly some of them are still going to have an advantage with that length, but it's definitely going to be mitigated this week. And you're going to need to be looking further down and making a bigger list of players when you're considering, people to bet and people to play for fantasy and things like that.
All right. A lot of the time we have weather conditions, maybe not the entirety of the tournament, but, maybe Thursday or the weekend, whatever it is. Any weather issues that we should be aware of for this tournament?
I mean, I would say straight up, like, no, really nothing. The main thing is, like, it is going to be hotter. I mean, it's getting up into the 90s on the weekend. The wind is pretty minimal. Maybe on the first couple days, you might want to lean towards the AM players, especially for first round betting. I think the greens will be more receptive for that. But, basically there's no rain in the forecast. It's going to be a little hot. If anything, the one thing that's going to happen is these greens, they could get really fast. The last time they played here in 2014, they made a specific effort to keep the greens like moderate. And even the moderate greens here played extremely hard. So if they let the greens get a little dried out, like, again, these are the toughest greens potentially like in the world. I mean, they're going to be tougher even than the Masters. So you could really see some things get crazy if the course dries out too much. So just something to keep in mind. Even in that scenario, I mean, I'm not really sure how you would adjust to that necessarily. The guys with the higher ball flight will be able to hold the greens more. But as we saw in 2014, like, how you handle yourself around the green is just as important. The scramble rates were really low here in 2014. They may have even been below 50%, which is pretty absurd. But again, you're going to see really fast greens and sunny skies most of the week.
All right. Anything specifically to know about the tournament format, how large the field is? Obviously, I'd say the quality of the field is going to be high. How many people make the cut? Just anything like that.
So the cut line is unique. It's top 60 in ties. So less than 50% of the field is making the weekend. Just making the cut here is like a big deal. There is, to qualify, the U.S. Open has a unique qualifying procedure. Just quickly, most people know it, but it's like the top 60 players get exemptions. Everyone else has to go through qualifying. So, some top players didn't qualify. Joaquin Niemann, who is, like still one of the best players in the world, didn't qualify. He's not here. But there's just other random people who like beat him over like a 36-hole stretch, like a guy like Willie Mack, and he's in the tournament. And nobody knows these guys, and they have no chance. But, in a one-day qualifier, they beat out like some good players. So just recognize there's some people at the bottom of the field that make no sense to worry about. But so there's what you call a little bit of dead money at the bottom of the field, but there's not much. It's still really tough to make the cut, and we do have a reduced cut line. If you're making like to make the cut parlays or picking people to miss the cut, I would say with the course involved and with the cut line the way it is, thinking about making miss the cut parlays or just looking at miss the cut bets is probably going to be a better option this week than going with make the cuts, where it's still kind of juiced, not in your favor with those make the cut bets at this event.
All right, well, let's start to get to the actual bets. Let's start with outright winners. You had mentioned volatility is something that we are very likely to see at this event that could result in a long shot winner or, long shot placement in the top 5. But looking at outright winners, who catches your eye first?
So, yeah, I've got a 3-pack here of guys that I'm kind of going to roll with this week. And I think that they all make sense when we're talking about this course. They're not who I would pick for a traditional U.S. Open. The first guy I would probably consider, but realistically, these have been like better Open Championship players, potentially better, maybe at the Masters or something like that, but not really guys who I would say like a traditional U.S. Open course. I would prefer other names, but first one going to be Viktor Hovland. You can still get Vic at plus 2,000. he had a terrible start to the year. He was trying to go through some swing changes. Victor Hovland went back to his old swing coach a couple weeks before the PGA Championship. He finished third at the PGA Championship, and his ball striking is back to where it's been. He's gaining strokes, multiple strokes on approach. His off the tee game is great. He's really controlling the ball flight again, which is great because his best work has come at these accuracy style courses where there's not much rough involved, where he can get a little volatile, where like the accuracy just sort of trumps the power. He's done well at the Players. He's done well at the Open Championship. He's finished top 12, top 15 at 3 Open Championship appearances. Victor Hovland's a great iron player. That's going to be big this week. I think approaches is going to be bigger than off the tee. And when you talk about Hovland, his biggest weakness is around the greens. But I think that the one thing you have to understand about Pinehurst is that it's just so unique around the greens that some of these bad players who aren't great scramblers are still going to do well because they're going to keep things really simple. Victor Hovland's probably going to come here and say, I'm just going to putt from off the greens. That's exactly what Martin Kaymer did. Martin Kaymer traditionally is one of the worst, was just a terrible chipper. That was kind of his Achilles heel. And I think from a player to player standpoint, Hovland reminds me a lot of Martin Kaymer. They're both really pure iron strikers. They're good putters, but they're just not very good around the greens. But Kaymer came here, kept it simple around the greens. I think Hovland can do the same. I just think when you look at Hovland's breadth of work, he makes a lot of sense here, and he's playing good golf again. Didn't have the greatest weekend last week, but again, struck the ball well. And at plus 2,000 on this course, his name just popped up. And I think that if you're taking a big name, I'm okay with this number. He's bigger than Morikawa. He's bigger than Rory. And I think Hovland has just as good a chance as either of those guys. So like him.
Okay. Any other outright winners, specifically kind of getting into that long shot territory?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned 3 guys off the top. The next 2 guys I'll talk about sort of in combo here. Tommy Fleetwood, you can still get him at plus 4,000 on FanDuel. And then Hideki Matsuyama, I got him at plus 5,000. I think that number is still available, bet 365. And I like both of these guys, not just as outright bets. Like Matsuyama, I took as an each way with the top 8. Certainly as a top 20, I think Matsuyama makes sense. And same with Fleetwood. These are players, Fleetwood has shown a lot of upside at U.S. Opens, but if you look at where he's done his best work at U.S. Opens, it's kind of not been on these bruising long courses. Like you look at, Shinnecock Hills, he had a good event, but the greens there were crazy. And a lot of people had trouble handling them. But Tommy Fleetwood went out and shot some crazy low rounds there. Erin Hills was another sort of weird venue where you couldn't really get in trouble off the tee. And Fleetwood finished like T2 there that year. So he's done well at these less sort of traditional U.S. Open venues, and I think that's going to strike here again. He's just a very complete player, not necessarily the same kind of firepower as a guy like Scheffler or Morikawa, but when you get him on these places like Open Championship venues, another event where he's done extremely well, he's got a runner-up finish in the Open, he can handle himself. And I think the same can be said for Hideki Matsuyama. He's already won a major, but he's very good around the greens. He's in one of those players where power-wise, sure, he's not Brooks Koepka, but he's very accurate with his irons. He's very good with his scoring clubs. And he played really well last week. And Hideki's short game has really impressed me all season. He is a guy who could come here and figure out these greens, I think, and really get in tune with his irons. Another player who reminds me a little bit of Martin Kaymer. He's got that skill throughout the bag. He's had an Achilles heel for most of his career, but if he could come to this place and figure out these greens quick, I really think he can get around here. So I like both these guys. I think for a non-traditional setup, they both make sense in their own right. And we're getting really good numbers here. Plus 4,000. It's the same kind of number Kaymer won at in 2014. So 2 guys with good upside. They've shown it in this event. They've shown it in other majors. And I think that they've looked good all season. And I think there's no harm in backing them at plus 4,000 or bigger. So Hovland, Fleetwood, Matsuyama, 3 main guys. I'm just going to shout out a couple of the favorites. I'm not betting Scheffler this week. I think the number is way too low for a volatile course like this. Certainly he makes sense. Xander, you're kind of buying the top of the market. If I did have any interest in betting a top player this week, it would be Rory McIlroy. But I think the better approach for Rory is that if you are into DFS or daily fantasy, I kind of like using Rory there. He's going to be lower owned there. You're going to get good leverage on the field. I think that's sort of a better option than taking like plus 1,100 or plus 1,200 to just bet him outright. I think that if you're betting outrights, I'd rather mix in guys like Fleetwood and Matsuyama than necessarily take a short number. But I do like Rory this week. He's another player I could see coming in here and potentially benefiting from the setup. So that's kind of where I'm sitting with my bets right now. There's certainly other players we could talk about, but those are the three guys I really like this week.
All right, well, let's talk about some of those other guys because I'm looking at the list, and you mentioned Fleetwood, Matsuyama, both of those guys at longer odds, but those guys, their odds aren't nearly as long as some of the other bets that you have listed here. So, talk to me about these. All of them are over, I believe, 100 to 1, or at least 100 to 1. So, talk to me about these.
So again, I can't emphasize enough, like this event could get, like, we could definitely see a crazy winner here. I think that is well within the cards. And just to reemphasize, Eric Compton, like 500 to 1, finished second here in 2014. Ricky Fowler went off at like 150 to 1 that week. He was really out of form. You can come here. If you figure out these greens, you're going to have a chance. Another comparable course, Kiowa Island, which we last saw in 2001, the PGA Championship. I think it compares at least a little bit. Phil Mickelson at 51 years old won that event at 250 to 1. I'm not saying we see a 250 to 1 winner, but certainly if there was ever going to happen at the US Open, which we have seen some long shot winners in the past, it could happen here. The first guy I'm going to talk about, and the guy I'm most intrigued by, Daniel Berger at 250 to 1. You can get him at a top 20 at plus 600, plus 650. It's the same price as Tiger Woods this week. Daniel Berger, if he had started the season healthy, he was coming back from an injury layoff, he could be going off at like 40, 35 to 1 at this event. This is a player who's gone off in the final group of a US Open before. He's top 10 at the Open Championship. He's grew up in Florida playing tight lies, windy conditions, these faster greens. And yes, he came back from injury. He hasn't necessarily shown top form yet, but you look at what he's done this year, it's been pretty solid. Like, his off the green game is good. He finds fairways. He's not going to get in trouble here. He's a smart player. He uses his strengths. He's a very good iron player. And like I said, he's one of those players who's used to playing these tight lies. So he's 250 to 1. And you can make the argument, yeah, he's not there, Geoff. This is kind of dead money. But, I think that what we've seen from Berger is that he's working his way back, and he's maybe not as far off as people think. He shot 65 to open his US Open qualifying, which really impressed me. I think there's at least a small chance here that Daniel Berger is just a little bit closer than people think, and that this number, if he is closer to that top form, it's pretty absurd, because this is a player who's defeated Colin Morikawa in a playoff. He's gone like wire to wire and fended off guys like Dustin Johnson and Brooks Koepka. He's a very quality player, and I like this setup for him. So he's definitely a player I'm going to be taking for some upside bets. Top 20 market I like. Certainly, I have a piece of him on an each way for a top 8. I think that's a great way to approach him. I really think that if he gets it going and he likes this course, he could potentially really surprise people and be that sort of Eric Compton-like player. So a player I think also for first-round leader bets you might want to think about as well. So Berger, really intriguing to me. Certainly a lot of volatility with a player like that. But yeah, I think from a setup perspective, that's the kind of player who could really benefit from Pinehurst. So interesting name for me there. My other two guys aren't quite as crazy. Sergio Garcia has played well all year. He played here in 2014. I think you can get him as big as like 125, 150 to 1. I took him with an each way at 110 to 1 on Bet365 and get that top 8. But Sergio's played pretty well at the US Open over his career. He's been kind of a disappointment in majors ever since he won his major, but he's played well this year. He got through qualifying, and I think he's kind of going to relish like a test like this. Again, veteran players we saw do very well at this event back in 2014. A lot of 35 plus year olds, guys who knew how to handle these weird setups. I think Sergio could come in here. He's very strong off the tee. His irons are great. He's done well at the Open. He's done well at TPC Sawgrass. I think this makes a lot of sense. He's been in great form all year. So Garcia, another player, I think for top 20 is going to make a lot of sense. I'm going to have my betting article out later in the day, later in the week, and he's going to be in it. He's going to be in it with some placement bets for sure. And then the third guy I have listed here, we talked about him a little bit at the PGA Championship, but Sepp Straka, the guy has 4 top 10s in his last 5 finishes. He's a good iron player. He can really get it going with the putter. I just think he's just being underrated here. And I think when you talk about setups, like Again, this is another player who's second at the Open Championship, one of the most volatile majors that we have just year to year with volatile setups. I mean, this should work in Sepp Straka's favor. So another foreign player, but a guy who's really shown his stuff well over the last year and a half. I think at that price, you've got to at least take a look at him for placement bets. So Berger, Garcia, Sepp Straka, three guys I'm rolling with, not just as outright bets, but in the placement markets as well.
All right. Anything you see in terms of making the cut, missing the cut? You had mentioned that market earlier as something that might have some potential. Anything catch your eye there?
Yeah, I think when I'm looking, again, I haven't necessarily made these bets yet, but like looking at make and miss the cuts bets, certainly I'm going to be looking at a couple guys, probably just playing them as straight bets to miss the cut here. I think there's just going to be a ton of volatility. And if you look back at 2014, we saw plenty of names sort of just, bomb out here early on. I mean, there's guys going down here like, Wyndham Clark, who's been in poor form, who I mentioned, he's plus 175 to miss the cut. I mean, this is a guy who missed the cut in a 60-man field last week, where the top 50 or 70-man field, where the top 50 in ties like made the cut. There are some players here who are not playing that great, who could really struggle around these greens. So I think if you're looking at players to miss the cut, look at those players who you think may struggle with this unique setup and specifically around the greens. So, a guy like Dustin Johnson is another player who sticks out. His number isn't as big, plus 137. Dustin played well here in 2016, but he's not the same player right now. Certainly has not played well in the majors this year. Even going up, we could see some of these bigger names like bomb out. I mean, even a guy like John Rahm, who's coming off an injury last week, plus 225, you can maybe put him in a parlay or something. So I think if you're making parlays, I may make like a 3-legger where it missed the cut parlay or something like that and see how that goes. But definitely leaning more towards that miss the cut than make the cut for this event.
All right. And then finally, anything for round one finishing position?
So again, don't quite have the tee times out, but I'll just go over it briefly. I mean, what we saw in 2014, we saw Keimer get out to that huge lead. And I don't think there's any harm in taking some of the names that you really like this week for the first round leader market. Got a guy like Fleetwood, a guy like Matsuyama. These are players we've seen can go low in these conditions. And I think they make a lot of sense as first round leaders. And I'll probably be betting both those guys first round leaders. But again, if you are leaning towards that long shot market, I mentioned Berger. I mentioned a guy like Sepp Straka. Players who've shown a little bit of form, shown some low rounds, and also potentially have advantageous tee times. I lean the morning here, but honestly, I think the weather's going to be good enough. I'm not sure it's necessarily going to matter too much. So don't have a huge tee time lead. Just looking for those guys with good Open Championship experience, good major experience. I'm definitely going to be taking a little bit of shot with Berger, Matsuyama, and Fleetwood there in that market, regardless of where their tee times are at.
All right. Out of all of the bets that you have mentioned, which one is your favorite?
I mean, I like Hideki Matsuyama this week quite a bit. I like the fact that he's still available. Like we talked about Matsuyama at the Masters podcast. He was like 28, 25 to 1. He's double that. And he played really well last week. I like his chances for a top 20, top 10 here. I'm not going to say his outright is necessarily my favorite bet, but I'll just say Matsuyama, in the top 20 market would probably be my favorite, just straight up bet. He's probably my favorite player, the guys that I mentioned, just from a betting perspective, but certainly those three, Hovland, Fleetwood, and Matsuyama, I kind of like equally just as an outright sort of package. So, but Matsuyama top 20, we'll leave it at that. I think he's going to have a real shot this week, potentially a good setup for a guy like Hideki.
All right, Geoff, this was fantastic. Best of luck to you with all of your bets, and best of luck to everyone who is tailing you. All right, that is going to do it for this episode of the Betting Life Show, brought to you by Fantasy Life. Please subscribe to the show and the newsletter. Tell your degenerate betting friends. Join the Discord, see all of our bets in the free Fantasy Life Bet Tracker, and follow us on social media at The Fantasy Grind and Matt F. the Oracle. Thank you, and see you again next episode.